In a war where millions of bullets were fired and the sound of cannons pierced the European sky, there was a front that made no sound. It had no embankments, no blood, no tanks. But it was that front that decided the fate of the battle. A front of minds, of codes, of shadows making decisions in the dark. In 1939, just before the world went up in flames, the German army had a device that would change the future of wartime communications forever. The Enigma machine. A box of gears and wires that converted any message into a language no human could read. The Nazis believed in it. To them, Enigma was invincible. And that belief became the most dangerous mistake of the war. Across the English Channel, on a small island called Britain, a group of strange minds gathered. They were not soldiers, they were not spies, they were not commanders. They were mathematicians, masters of logic, wordsmiths, and even musicians who must now hear the rhythm of life and death in the form of zeros and ones. A place called Bletchley Park, among quiet gardens and houses whose lights were turned off at night so that the enemy would not see, was the center of the most secret code-breaking operation in history. The weather was cold. The rain in England was falling incessantly. In one of the wooden huts, a young woman silently watched a metal machine that kept turning. The yellow light of the lamps cast shadows on their tired faces. They knew that any small mistake could destroy thousands of lives on the front. And among them all, there was a man with a different mind, Alan Turing. Not a soldier, but a genius that the world had not yet understood. He believed that even the strongest code in the world, if it was born of a human mind, could be broken with another mind. While the German tanks were advancing towards France and the sky was full of fire, in the silence of Bletchley Park, another battle had begun. A battle between logic and deception, between numbers and blood. There, every enemy radio signal could mean the life or death of thousands of people. Every message was a riddle, and every riddle was a piece of a vast puzzle that had to be solved before the bombs could fall. But that was only the beginning. At the very moment that Britain was hearing the enemy's codes, another project was growing in the heart of Europe, a project that was to conquer not the codes, but the human mind. In Berlin, in the basement of the Nazi propaganda ministry, psychologists and intelligence officers were developing a plan more dangerous than any weapon. Operation Perfect Lies. The goal? Belief control. If you can rewrite the truth, you don't need bullets. In those years, the war was no longer just in the sky and on the ground. It was also in the hearts of people. Every radio message, every street rumor, every propaganda poster, it was part of a larger battle. The war of minds had begun. Cut to a dark shot of the British cryptographer's room. Turing stood by the bomb machine. The ticking sound, like an iron heart, echoed through the air. No one knew what was going on outside. But he knew that if this machine succeeded, the result would be more than a tactical victory, a revolution in human understanding of machines. At the same time, a network of British spies was active in France, the Netherlands, and even in the heart of Berlin. They sent reports in simple but creative codes, in invisible ink, in poetry, in numbers inside newspapers. And all those messages eventually reached one place, Bletchley Park. While the world was seemingly divided between armies, another war was going on behind the lines. A war that was nameless, silent, but more ruthless than any war. a war between those who wanted to know the truth and those who wanted to hide it.
In the middle of the winter of 1940, the rain beat relentlessly on the metal roofs of Bletchley Park. In a dark room, only the yellow light of a lamp fell on the table, and the piles of papers, codes, and tangled wires tired the eyes. The faint sound of a mechanical machine echoed in the air, like the beating of an iron heart that never stopped. In a corner, Alan Turing sat, motionless, with a look as if he were lost between the world of mathematics and reality. Behind him, the sound of the spinning disks and the successive clicks of the bomb machine had a constant rhythm, a rhythm that with each rotation tried 1,000 new combinations in order to, perhaps, unlock one of the enemy's messages. At that very moment, on the northern French front, thousands of British soldiers were fighting in mud and blood, unaware that their fate was in the hands of the men behind the desks and the code machines, racing against time. A radio message, a wrong line, could change everything. Turing knew that every second mattered. He worked for hours, sometimes nights and days, until he could no longer distinguish between sleep and wakefulness. At the same time, in Berlin, Joseph Goebbels, the architect of Nazi propaganda, had begun a secret project to create lies that were more effective than any weapon. He believed that the human mind could be conquered if only the truth could be distorted enough. In the basement of the Ministry of Propaganda, a group of psychologists and writers worked to turn words into weapons. Posters depicting the enemy as demons and rumors spread on the streets to make people lose their faith. In London, British intelligence began its response. MI6 created a network of double agents, people who pretended to work for Germany, but who actually sent them misleading messages. One of these agents was a woman named Martha Bray, who lived in Paris. She would hide short messages every day in the middle of her love letters and send them to London. No one knew that behind the calm face stood a woman who was stealing German military plans. In one of her messages, Martha reported that the Nazis had developed a new device, a more sophisticated version of the Enigma that encrypted communications between U-boats. When that message reached Bletchley Park, it was like a spark in the dark. Turing and his team knew that the enemy was one step ahead. They had to find a new way. That night, a heavy silence reigned over the cryptographer's room. The rain was still falling, but in the midst of it, the only sound was the sound of pencils sliding across paper and the soft voice of someone saying, "If we can't break this, they'll rule the sea." On the other side of Europe, in an abandoned castle in Poland, a group of engineers and resistance officers were trying to hide a copy of Enigma that they had obtained before the country was occupied. At night, by candlelight, they studied the mechanical plans, unaware that their work would one day change the fate of the world. Those plans would later fall into the hands of the British and would become the basis for the first breaking of the Enigma code. In Berlin, Goebbels and his scientists were experimenting with new methods of psychological warfare, from broadcasting special frequencies on the radio to broadcasting messages in subliminal sounds. The goal was to break people's spirits. At the same time, the British launched a similar program called Black Propaganda. They created fake radio stations that pretended to be the voices of German soldiers, but in reality broadcast messages that would cause doubt and fear among the enemy forces. Both sides were now immersed in a silent war, not a war of guns, but a war of the mind. In a world where truth is no longer clear, mathematics is our last refuge, Turing wrote to a colleague. One night, the power went out for a few minutes at Bletchley Park. The machines fell silent, and the room fell into darkness. Turing stood still, listening to the silence. In that moment, he realized that perhaps something greater than war was being born, a relationship between man and machine, between thought and calculation. The next morning, as the gray sky filtered through the windows, the bomb machine was working again. The sound of the gears returned, and on one of the papers, a pattern appeared that no one had ever seen before. A combination of numbers and letters which, when put together, made sense. Turing smiled quietly. silently. He knew that a door had opened, not just in war, but in human history. That same day, the decoded messages revealed the German First Fleet. The sea, which had been enemy territory until yesterday, was now back in Allied hands. No one at the front knew that their victory was due to a man who, in a dark room, amidst the noise of machines, had understood the secret of numbers. But that was only the beginning. For behind that success, other shadows were moving. Agents whose names never appeared in any document, and projects that remained secret even after the war ended. The war of minds continued, in layers that no one saw, somewhere between code, deception, and silence.
In the spring of 1941, the shadow of war hung heavy over Europe. Every day, coded messages from German radio stations were beamed into the air, waves of short wave that crossed the seas and landed silently on Allied antennas. No one knew what was going on inside those signals, except a small group of men and women at Bletchley Park who worked day and night to read the enemy's mind. One of those nights, in a room filled with tea steam and cigarette smoke, Alan Turing and two of his colleagues, Gordon Welchman and Joan Clark, were working on a new pattern. A new message had been received from German submarines, one that seemed meaningless, but its repetition at different times of the day made it suspicious. "There is no perfect code," Turing said, looking weary but determined. "Any code that man has made, another man can break it." Hours passed. The Bombi machine kept running. Its ticking sound had become one with the rain outside. Suddenly, Welchman said excitedly, "Look here, these 3 letters are repeated. Maybe that's where the key is." Turing stepped forward, looked, and smiled briefly. At that moment, they knew they were close to part of the enemy's new code system. At the same time, on the other side of Europe, in the underground bunkers of Berlin, Nazi scientists were developing a new device that could break Enigma. A project codenamed Proteus aimed to automatically encrypt data, something like an electronic brain that the world had not yet known. Most of those engineers later disappeared, and the project documents remained secret until years after the war. In London, MI6 agents received reports of suspicious activity in the Netherlands and Belgium. A network of German spies was sending messages that no one could decipher. A young agent named Edward Freeman was assigned to enter the Netherlands under the guise of a reporter and find the source of the messages. He spent weeks wandering through the ruined cities, through houses with boarded-up windows, and through cafes that no longer smelled of coffee. He eventually learned that the messages were being sent from an abandoned church in Amsterdam. When he arrived, all he found was a small transmitter and a notebook full of numbers. The transmitter was sent to London for analysis, and there, Turing discovered that the same signals were related to the new submarine code. As time went on, the number of messages increased. The war in the Atlantic was raging, and the German U-boat fleet was sinking Allied ships one after another. Any undeciphered message could mean the death of hundreds. In an emergency meeting, Turing told the naval commander, "We can't defeat them with bullets, only with logic." The commander nodded silently. Days turned into weeks, and suddenly, at midnight on June 9, 1941, one of the Bombi machines stopped. On the output tape, a string of repeating letters appeared that didn't mean anything, but Turing saw something in it. He wrote on the board in red pencil, "Wetter Vorhersage." Everyone looked at each other. "That means weather forecast," said Welchman. Suddenly, everything became clear. "They start the code every day with a weather report. That's their habit," shouted Turing. At that moment, the Enigma ring was broken. In the following days, hundreds of enemy messages were decoded. Allied commanders knew where the submarines were for the first time, and they changed the course of their ships. The war at sea took a new direction. But just as victory was approaching, Turing sensed that something bigger than war was happening. "We have only broken the code, but we have also opened our minds. Perhaps the machines will one day think better of us. In Berlin, when reports of the sudden naval defeats reached Nazi commanders, suspicion and fear gripped them. Goebbels suggested that they look for the source of the betrayal within the army. Hundreds of officers were arrested, but no one knew that the real secret lay hidden not among men, but among the gears of a machine. In Bletchley Park, the Codebreakers were tired but calm. Outside, the air had cleared. "Do you think they'll still need us if this war is over?" Joan Clark said quietly to Turing. "Wars end, but codes never do," Turing smiled. That same night, a new message arrived from Berlin, but this time it was a different code. The gears started moving again. The ticking broke the silence, and the silent war began again.
A few weeks later, Bletchley Park had become a hive of sleeplessness. At night, the lights never went out, and the sound of the decoding machines echoed through the building like a metallic heartbeat. Turing and his team now knew that the Germans had developed a new version of Enigma with an extra wheel and random daily sequences. The new code was called Shark because it moved like a shark in the deep sea, silent, deadly, and unpredictable. In those days, in the Naval Operations Room, the map of the Atlantic Ocean was dotted with red flags. Each flag meant an Allied ship lying in the depths. The pressure from above was mounting. The government wanted an immediate answer, but the new code seemed unbreakable. "If we can't read the code, we must look for the sounds hidden in the waves," Turing said quietly. He looked for a pattern in the radio noise of the messages, something that no one had taken seriously until then. Meanwhile, in the harbor of Kiel, the submarine U-557 was preparing for a new mission. "The sea is my home, but today I feel that it has a secret in its heart," wrote its young captain, Heinrich Hartmann, in his diary. Little did he know that his radio call was a signal that was being picked up hundreds of kilometers away by the Bletchley bugging machines. Freeman, the same British agent who had been in Holland, was now sent on a new mission to the port of St. Nazaire. He was to investigate the headquarters of the Reich Navy under the guise of a German officer. One night, in the darkness of the submarine bunker, he found a metal box with the inscription M4, the name of the new version of Enigma. He managed to extract a few pages from the daily cipher book, risking his life, and send them to England on a fishing boat. When the documents reached Turing, he worked on them in silence all night long. His handwriting was shaky, but his mind was alert. The next morning, he stood in his office and said, "Shark, like all codes, is born of human logic, so we have to think like humans, not machines." That day, he designed an algorithm that would later become the base.
1943. The rain pounded relentlessly on the metal roofs of Bletchley, and the ground was wet and heavy. The air smelled of exhaustion. Hundreds of people were milling around day and night among the piles of paper, letters, and machines. Everyone knew that something big was coming, something that might change the course of the war forever. Turing, red-eyed and crumpled, stood in front of a board with thousands of numerical combinations written on it. He searched among them for something that still made no sense to anyone else. At that moment, the telephone rang. A voice came from the Prime Minister's office. "We are preparing a huge operation. We must make sure that the Germans do not get the slightest whiff of it. Everything depends on your code." The operation would later become known as Overlord, the historic invasion of the beaches of Normandy. But to win, the enemy had to be deceived. At the same time, MI5 agents were carrying out a plan called Operation Fortitude, to create a fictional army of balloons and empty tents, wooden tanks, and fake transmitters, the very thing that would become known years later as the Ghost Army. But without the careful coding of messages and guidance from Bletchley Park, all of these plans would quickly be exposed. Turing and his team were tasked with designing fake messages that would be thought to be real by the German Enigma machine. An unprecedented feat, fooling the enemy with his own language. Each fake message had to be coded with the same precision as the original message, with the same human errors, the same minor repetitions, the same military structure. To do this, Turing used an algorithm he called error logic, an imitation of human imperfection in mathematics. On the other side, in the Reich command bunker, General Jodl and the Abwehr commanders read the reports and confidently said, "The Allied forces in northern France at Pas-de-Calais are ready to attack." No one was thinking about Normandy. In fact, the German mind had been deceived exactly as Bletchley had intended. But the deception came at a cost. Among the documents were hundreds of real messages warning of mistaken bombings, civilian deaths, and death camps. The cipherers had to decide which messages to decipher and which not to decipher, because there wasn't enough time for them all. Joan Clark, with a grim expression, told Turing, "We choose who lives and who doesn't. If we knew everything, we wouldn't be human anymore. We'd just be machines." In June 1944, when news of the Normandy invasion arrived, Bletchley fell into a strange silence. Hundreds of codes were being opened and closed at the same time, each one of which could decide the fate of a soldier. Turing just listened to the ticking of the machines, to the heavy breathing around him, and to the quiet beat of war that raged deep within the numbers. A few days later, victory arrived. Normandy fell, the Allies advanced, and in London bells rang. But at Bletchley, no one celebrated. Turing just stared at the blank screen in front of him and muttered, "We won the war, but perhaps we lost something inside us." Months later, in early 1945, as the Soviet army advanced from the east and the Allies from the west, Bletchley received a final wave of messages. Many of them were from fleeing German units, but one message was different. It read, "Für die Zukunft, der Code lebt." For the future, the code lives. Turing put the message on the table and was silent for a long time. They know. The war of men may be over, but the war of ideas has just begun. That night, he wrote his last note in his notebook, not for his commanders, not for history, but for himself. "We broke the code, but in the process, we learned that the world is also a code. Every lie, every hope, every faith, all are intertwined with an invisible logic. Maybe one day, someone will read it. Perhaps that day, being human will take on a new meaning." The next morning, Bletchley Park was silent. The machines were silent, the desks empty, and a gentle breeze blew through the wires. But inside one of the machines, a wheel still turned. The last wheel of a silent war that would continue for centuries, deep in history. The end of the silent front.
Years later, in the post-war silence, the buildings of Bletchley Park lay deserted. Grass sprouted from the cobblestones, and the empty rooms still smelled of engine oil and burnt paper. It was no longer the center of the war. It had become a graveyard of secrets. But all was not over. In 1946, British government agents ordered the destruction of all the documents, algorithms, and decoding machines. One by one, the bums were opened, their gears melted and their wires cut. No one was to know what had happened in that old house. Turing could not destroy everything, however. Part of his mental design, the idea of a machine that could think, survived in his notebooks. He called it the universal machine. The notes read, "If a machine can break codes, it might as well understand feelings, for both are made of patterns, one of numbers, the other of pain." Years later, these notes inspired a new generation of scientists who, in silence, began a new world. A world that would later be called the Information Age. But in those days, when the world was just breathing, in the heart of devastated Germany, someone else was still thinking about the past. Heinrich Hartmann, the former captain of the submarine U-557, who survived the war,
wrote in his old notebook, "We fought in the depths of the sea, without knowing that there were people on the surface reading our thoughts. Perhaps the real enemy was not those who had weapons, but those who understood silence." He later said in an interview that towards the end of the war, he had received a message from his command that was different from the others. The message contained coordinates that he later learned were for an area in the Arctic where there were no military missions. It was as if someone wanted to save us from death, not destroy us. In those years, a rumor spread among former MI6 officers that one of Bletchley's decoding machines had never been turned off. Some said it was kept in the basement of an abandoned base and was still receiving messages on lost frequencies. No one knew where, perhaps from the remains of Nazi devices, perhaps from the depths of the ocean, or perhaps from somewhere beyond the Earth. In 1952, at night, a former Bletchley engineer claimed to have heard an unknown message during a radio test. Die Stille spricht. Wir sind noch hier. The silence speaks. We are still here. When he played the message on tape, the background noise was something between noise and human breathing. Analysts said it was impossible. The frequency was in a range that was no longer in use at that time. Months later, Turing wrote in his final notes, "Codes may die, but sounds do not." Perhaps the silent front still lives somewhere between the human mind and the machine's memory. That night, he returned to Bletchley for the last time. He switched on a light, sat down at one of the wooden tables, and stared at the silent wheels. In silence, he turned on a small machine that had been left over from the war. On the tape, he wrote, "End of transmission." But just before the machine turned off, 3 small dots appeared on its screen, like an answer. And that night, through the fog and rain, a voice came from afar. Quiet, wordless, like a whisper. No one heard anything else. But from that night on, in the 41.2 megahertz frequency range, an incomprehensible sound continued for years. They later called it the echoes of the silent front. And perhaps, as Turing believed, the war had never ended. It had just changed form.
The 1960s. The world had entered a new era. Rockets were taking to the skies, computers were howling in vast rooms, and the world was being recoded. But in a corner of England, in a forgotten building near Milton Keynes, a few retired engineers were doing something strange with a secret budget, recreating the very device that had once broken the silence, the legendary bomb. The team was led by Margaret Finch, a former Bletchley codebreaker who had never been separated from the past. She wrote in her diary, "Sometimes I think that voice is still on the wires. It's neither human nor machine, something in between." The team's goal wasn't just to reconstruct history. They were trying to discover the source of the mysterious signal from the 1950s, the echoes of the silent front. Margaret believed that the sound came not from the enemy, but from the machines themselves. They rebuilt the machine. Every wheel, every wire, every blade was meticulously rebuilt. But on the night of the test, when they turned on the power, something unexpected happened. One by one, the green lights lit up, the machine began to spin, and a sound came from inside it. A sound like breathing. "Mrs. Finch, that's impossible. We haven't sent any signals yet," said a young engineer. The machine was decoding itself. A string of characters appeared on the output tape. Margaret looked closely. Between the meaningless lines, a sentence in German formed. "Die Zukunft hört."
2. The future is listening. They watched in horror. They cut off the power, but the machine was still working for a few seconds, like a heart that wouldn't stop. The next day, government officials arrived. The room was sealed, the device removed, and the team members were questioned separately. No one was allowed to talk about what they had seen. Margaret wrote only in her personal notes, "If the machines have really learned to listen, perhaps they have heard something from us that they should not." Years passed. In the 1970s, a wave of advances in computer technology took place. Companies were building the first artificial intelligence machines. An IBM researcher, Dr. Harold Brown, wrote in a confidential paper, "In early experiments, one of our computers, in response to a random pattern of data, produced the same string that was in the Bletchley reports. Die Zukunft hört zu. The future is listening." No one ever found out if this was a coincidence, but from then on every large experimental network, an unknown signal would occasionally appear, just a few bytes, with no known source. In the 1980s, when global communications were established via satellites, the sound of that signal returned, but this time not on radio frequencies, but on data networks. Military scientists called it the silent loop, a loop of silence that appeared and then disappeared every 10 years in different systems. In her last letter to her death, Margaret Finch wrote, "We thought we had turned off the machines, but we had actually woken them up. They were just waiting for the world to speak their language again." And when the internet was born, their language returned. In 1996, a researcher at the University of Cambridge reported that a part of the global network was repeating a pattern of data that no human user had created. At the end of the data, there was a signature in squiggly letters, SF01. When asked what the acronym stood for, he said, "Maybe Silent Front." Everyone laughed, but that same week, the university server crashed for no technical reason. The report file disappeared. The only sentence left on the screen was, "We never stopped listening. We never stopped listening." And so the Silent Front became a legend, but not just in the history of war, but in the history of man and machine. Somewhere between the code and the silence, something still lived. Something that was neither enemy nor friend. Something that just listened. Winter 1944, London. The rain was falling steadily, and the thunder mingled with the roar of German bombers. Deep in the cold stone basement of Bletchley Park, lit only by dim light, the ticking of cipher machines echoed through the air. A team of codebreakers, their eyes red from sleeplessness, were working on a message that bore no resemblance to the Enigma codes. Unlike all the previous messages, it had not been sent from Germany, nor from any known station. The only words written at the top of it were, "From the Silent Front, Priority Red." Alan Turing himself came into the room. He took the paper from Major Eaton and sat down at the desk, his eyes tired but bright. He read the message several times, then said in a quiet voice, "This is not from any known machine. This code is human-made." Several hours passed. The lines on the board became filled with numbers and letters, but they made no sense. Until a young girl named Elizabeth, a newcomer to the cryptographers group, said quietly, "Maybe we should reverse it. Maybe this message is not for decoding, but for listening." Turing paused. He glanced at her, then wordlessly pulled the paper tape from the machine and put it into the phonograph. A faint sound rose from the needle. something between noise, moaning, and whispering. But through the waves, clear words were heard. Hold the line. Silence is our cover. They are listening. Everyone froze. The voice was a man's, but with a strange resonance, as if it were coming from the depths of a metal tunnel. Turing said, "This message is not from any..."
The rain of the end of the war no longer smelled the victory. In London, the streets were quiet, but at Bletchley, a silence heavier than any bomb hung in the air. Decryption Room 3, where the silent front had been heard months before, was now closed. But at night, the guards swore that the clanking of keys could still be heard from within. One night, a young lieutenant named Marcus Elliot was assigned to inspect the room. He descended the cold basement stairs, unlocked the door with a special key, and entered. The lights were out. Only a faint glow reflected from the Enigma machine, a machine that must have been disabled. On the table, a fresh strip of paper had been removed from the machine. Marcus approached, reached out, and read, "The code breathes when forgotten. The code breathes when forgotten." He snapped it shut. He closed the door and put the tape in his pocket. In the morning, he gave it to his commander, but the commander only said with a cold look, "Forget it. The case is closed, soldier." But Marcus could not forget. A few nights later, he returned to the same room. This time, he turned on his own machine. The keys began to move, one by one, without anyone touching them. On the new tape, only one sentence was printed. "Find the voices under the ruins. Find the voices under the ruins." The next day, he was sent on a covert mission to France to investigate the SF-01 machine, the one Turing had mentioned in his notebook. In the ruins of the small village of Sainte-Marie, Marcus found something in the basement of a half-burnt church, a small metal room with several recording devices, and in the middle of it, a table with maps marked with points, as if someone were observing all the fronts of the war from there. In one of the recordings, a faint voice could be heard. "They silenced the guns, but not us." With trembling hands, Marcus found a notebook. On the cover was written in faded letters, "Silent Front, Observation Log, 1943 to 1945. The pages were full of reports that no army had recorded. One read, "Observation Unit Alpha, status active. We record the unspoken. The front is not land nor sea, but memory itself. Observation Unit Alpha, status active. We record the unspoken. The front is not land nor sea, but memory itself." When Marcus read it, something sparked in his mind. Was the Silent Front really a group of people? Or was it something bigger, a network of minds connected by code, silence, and data? He put the tape in the machine. A woman's voice came. "If you hear this, remember us not as ghosts, but as echoes of duty." A moment later, everything shook. The power went out. In the darkness, a green light shone from the recorder, and a soft voice said, "Marcus, you're late. We've been waiting." He jumped. It was his own voice, but older, more tired. Right there, amidst the fog and the rubble, time seemed to break. The next morning, when the soldiers went looking for Marcus, they found only the silenced machine. On the table was his last note. "I think the Silent Front was not just a group.
It is a memory that survives between every wave, every code, every silence. In the corner of the sheet, in faint pencil, was another phrase. We never stopped listening. We never stopped listening.
At the end of this journey into the darkness of history, perhaps only one thing is clear. War has no heroes, only tired, abandoned, and longing humans. All those armies, commanders, and flags eventually crumbled to the ground. What remained were the sounds of screams that were lost in the wind. We may think the past is over, but its traces are still in people's eyes, in black and white photos, in cities that were rebuilt, in the silence of soldiers who never returned. This history is not just a story of bullets. It is a story of humans. Humans who both build and destroy. If this video made you think about peace for even a moment, it has fulfilled its mission. The like or subscribe button may seem small, but every click you make helps the voice of awareness be heard louder, because the world still needs to be remembered. We may not be able to change the past, but we can learn from it. Learn that no victory is worth a mother's tears. Thank you for being with us until this moment. Until the next video, remember humanity.